Everyone thought Ethan Carter was just a struggling single dad living alone in an old house at the edge of town. That was the label people attached to him. The way they attach labels to things they don't fully understand quickly, conveniently, without much thought. The women at the community center called him dependable. The men who worked alongside him called him quiet. The children who passed his house on the way to school called him the gardening man. Because no matter the season, no matter the hour, there was always something blooming along his fence line. But none of them truly knew him, including Sophia Bennett, the millionaire businesswoman who accidentally met him during a charity fundraiser on a Thursday evening in early October, when the air smelled like wood smoke and the leaves had turned the color of old copper. She had walked into that event expecting to do what she always did: write a check, shake hands, smile for photographs, and leave feeling like she had contributed something meaningful to the world. She had not expected to find herself standing across a crowded room, unable to stop watching a quiet man in a faded flannel shirt refuse, for the third time in an hour, to accept a single dollar of financial assistance. The fundraiser was held at the Millbrook Community Center, a modest brick building that Ethan himself kept running with patched pipes and repainted walls, and a heating system he had personally rebuilt from parts he sourced online over the course of 2 winters. Sophia had donated enough money to keep the lights on for the next 4 years. She wore a navy dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and she moved through the room with the practiced ease of someone who had attended hundreds of events exactly like this one. She was not unkind. She was not arrogant. She simply existed in a different world than most of the people in that room. And everyone present understood that unspoken fact without needing to discuss it. The tables were covered in white cloth and small potted flowers, and somewhere near the back, a piano player worked through a soft jazz standard that no one was really listening to. Sophia was halfway through a conversation with a city council member about zoning regulations when she noticed Ethan for the first time. He was standing beside an elderly man named Walter, who had spilled an entire glass of water across the tablecloth and was now trying to mop it up with a paper napkin while looking mortified. Ethan had appeared from somewhere, the way people who are always quietly paying attention appear when they are needed, and without saying a word he had produced a clean towel, righted Walter's glass, replaced the soaked napkin with a fresh one, and then sat down beside the old man and said something that made him laugh. Then he stood, excused himself, and moved back toward the maintenance hallway as if the entire thing had not happened. Sophia watched the whole exchange. Something about it caught in her chest. Later that evening, she learned that a local nonprofit had tried to offer Ethan a housing assistance grant. He had declined it politely, saying there were families who needed it more. A board member of the center had tried to give him a bonus check for the winter repair work he had done. He had redirected it toward the food pantry fund. When the event coordinator offered him a complimentary dinner ticket for the fundraiser gala happening the following month, he had said he appreciated the thought, but that he wouldn't be able to attend. Every act of generosity aimed in his direction seemed to slide off him like rain off a roof. Not out of pride, Sophia thought, but out of something more complicated than that. Something she couldn't name yet. She was used to understanding people quickly. It was a skill she had developed over 15 years of running a philanthropic foundation, of sitting across tables from people who needed things, and people who had things to give, and figuring out how to connect them. She could read a room, read a face, read the particular set of someone's shoulders when they were ashamed or desperate or grateful. But Ethan Carter defied her usual categories. He didn't look ashamed of his circumstances, like a man who had made a decision a long time ago and had never once second-guessed it. On her way out of the event, she passed near the maintenance hallway and overheard 2 volunteers talking in low voices. One of them said, "In the way people say things, they believe to be common knowledge. If you knew the whole story about Ethan, you would never look at him the same way again." The other one nodded slowly. "I know," she said. "I know." Sophia paused for just a moment on the other side of the wall, the words settling into her like a stone dropped into still water, and then she walked out into the cool October night carrying a question she hadn't arrived with. She spent the next several days doing what she always did. When something puzzled her, she gathered information. She asked around, gently, carefully, the way you probe around a sore tooth without quite pressing on it, learning the shape of the absence before you learn the thing itself. What she discovered was surprisingly little. Ethan Carter, 38 years old, had worked at the Millbrook Community Center for 6 years. He was unfailingly reliable, almost preternaturally competent with his hands, and completely unknown as a person. He had no presence on any digital platform. He did not appear in any local news archives from the past half-decade. He paid his bills on time, kept to himself, and seemed to have no social life to speak of, though he was never rude, never cold, simply private in a way that felt deliberate rather than antisocial, chosen rather than imposed. A few of the longer-tenured staff remembered that he had arrived in Millbrook about 7 years ago, and that he had seemed, even then, like a man who was choosing a smaller life rather than falling into one. The distinction being visible only to those who looked carefully, who knew what it looked like when a person had options and set them aside. One woman who ran the center's art supply closet told Sophia that Ethan sometimes stopped to look at the paintings the community class students left drying on the racks, and that his expression when he looked at them was different from his expression at other times. Softer, she said. Sadder, too. Sophia wrote this down in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. She wrote, "Sadder, too." She underlined it twice. She called him one afternoon and asked if she could stop by. He was quiet for a moment, and then said that was fine. He supposed, though he wasn't sure what she was hoping to find. She said she wasn't sure either, which was true, and he seemed to accept that answer. She drove to his house on a rainy Saturday in mid-October, following the GPS down a series of increasingly narrow roads until the town gave way to open land and old trees, and then a house appeared at the end of a gravel drive, partially hidden behind a row of birches, whose leaves had turned a pure and startling yellow. She sat in her car for a moment before getting out. The house was old white clapboard, a deep front porch, windows that had clearly been reglazed at some point and were slightly uneven in their frames. It was not large. It was not impressive by any external measure, but it was immaculate in a way that surprised her, and the garden surrounding it was something else entirely. Even in October, even with most things dying back for the season, there was an order and intention to every bed, every border, every carefully edged pathway. Climbing roses had been trained along the porch railing and tied off for winter. A row of ornamental cabbages ran the length of the front walk in shades of purple and cream. A Japanese maple near the corner of the house had been pruned into a shape that looked almost like a gesture, like an open hand. None of this matched the picture of a struggling man she had unconsciously assembled. She stood on the porch for a moment in the soft rain before knocking, looking out at the garden, and feeling the first quiet shift of something she hadn't expected to feel. He answered the door in a work shirt and old jeans, a cup of coffee in his hand, and he looked at her with those eyes she had noticed at the fundraiser gray. Steady, and holding something behind them that she still couldn't quite read, he stepped back and let her in without ceremony. The front hallway smelled like old wood and something faintly floral, dried lavender maybe, and the floors were worn but clean, and there was a coat rack by the door, with a single jacket hanging from it, and a pair of boots set neatly beneath. She followed him into the living room, and then she stopped. She stopped because the far wall of the room, a wall that must have been 12 feet wide and 8 feet high, was completely covered in photographs. Not hung casually. Not scattered like a collage. Arranged. Carefully, deliberately, obsessively arranged in a kind of timeline that ran from left to right and floor to ceiling. The older images faded and mounted on cardboard, the newer ones printed on heavier paper, each one separated by just enough space to breathe. There were easily 200 photographs, maybe more. And in nearly all of them, there was a woman, the same woman, dark hair, a wide smile that looked like it had been painted by someone who loved her face, paint-stained hands in many of the photos, a laugh that Sophia could somehow sense even in the still images. She was photographed in studios and fields and city streets and kitchens and galleries, and one particularly beautiful image that appeared to have been taken on a mountain somewhere. The woman turned away from the camera and looking out over an enormous valley, her coat caught sideways in the wind. Sophia stood in front of that wall and felt something in her chest tighten and then release, the way it does when you encounter something true. She hadn't heard Ethan come to stand beside her. "Her name was Emma," he said. His voice was quiet, the way it always was, but there was a different quality to it now. Something stripped back. Emma Reyes. Sophia didn't say anything. She looked at a photograph near the center of the wall, Emma at what appeared to be an outdoor art fair, standing beside a large canvas painting, laughing at something off camera, her arms crossed over her chest and her head tilted back. She looked luminously, completely alive. "How long were you together?" Sophia asked. 8 years, Ethan said. He took a sip of his coffee and looked at the wall, the way people look at things they have looked at 10,000 times before and still cannot look away from. "She passed away 9 years ago." Sophia turned to look at him then, but he was still looking at the wall. She noticed a small framed letter on the side table near the sofa, handwritten in looping cursive on pale green paper, and a glass jar on the windowsill filled with pencils that had been sharpened down to almost nothing, and a sketchbook lying open to a page covered in small botanical drawings, done in graphite and colored pencil. She realized that the entire room was, in some way she was only beginning to understand, a portrait of Emma. Not a shrine exactly. Not something frozen or morbid. Something more like a continued presence. A conversation that had never stopped. She walked slowly along the length of the wall, looking at the faces, the moments, the years, and somewhere around the third photograph from the right end of the middle row she felt the tears come, not dramatically, not with any particular trigger she could identify, just quietly, the way water rises through stone. She noticed, on her way back along the wall, that there was a door at the far end of the room that was closed, and that, unlike every other door in the house, this one had a lock, a simple bolt lock, slid across. She didn't ask about it, but she noticed it. Ethan watched her notice it, and something in his face shifted, not closed off, exactly, but braced. He excused himself to refill his coffee, and she stood alone in the room for a moment, looking at the closed door, and then back at the wall, and she thought about what the volunteer had said at the fundraiser. If you knew the whole story, you would never look at him the same way again. She was beginning to understand that this was not hyperbole. When Ethan returned, she asked him about Emma. She asked carefully, in the way she had learned to ask questions of people who carried things they had never been asked about before, slowly, without pressure, leaving space. He stood with his back against the wall and told her some things. That Emma had been a painter, that she had grown up in Santa Fe and moved to the city in her mid-20s to study at an art institute, and that she had been completely committed to her work in a way that Ethan had loved and admired from the first time he saw it, that she had painted in a style that was hard to categorize, not quite realism, not quite abstraction, something in between, something that made you feel like you were looking at the emotional truth of a place rather than its physical surface, that she had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition in her early 30s, that had taken her slowly, over the course of 4 years, until it had taken her entirely. After a long pause, during which neither of them spoke and the rain continued quietly against the windows, Ethan set down his coffee cup and crossed the room and reached out and slid the bolt on the locked door. The door opened onto a small room, not much larger than a generous closet, that had a north-facing window and bare white walls, and a wooden floor that was permanently stained in 100 places with oil paint in every color. Along the walls were canvases large and small, stacked and hung, dozens of them, more than Sophia could count at a glance. Rolled tubes of paper leaned against one corner. A wooden flat file cabinet stood against the far wall, its drawers labeled in Emma's handwriting. On a narrow shelf above the window, a row of composition notebooks sat shoulder to shoulder, their spines facing out, each one labeled with a year, and scattered across every surface: the windowsill, the top of the flat file, the edge of a folding table in the corner, were objects that had been arranged with obvious care. A small terracotta pot with a dried wildflower in it, a broken paintbrush whose bristles had been tied back with twine, a folded paper crane, a strip of film negatives curled into a loose coil, a child's compass with a pencil still in it. Sophia stepped into the room and stood very still. The air in there was different from the air in the rest of the house. Older, somehow. More concentrated. She looked at the paintings, those she could see fully. Those stacked facing out, and felt the same thing she had felt looking at the photographs on the wall, only stronger now, more immediate. Emma's paintings were extraordinary. She was not an art critic, but she knew what it felt like to stand in front of something made by a person who was trying to say something true, and that was exactly the feeling she had now, multiplied by the sheer volume of work surrounding her. There were landscapes, there were portraits, there were large, abstract pieces that seemed to hum with internal color. There were small, intimate studies, a hand, a window, a bowl of fruit that were as precise and tender as anything she had seen in a museum. She made all of this, Sophia said. Ethan was standing in the doorway. Most of it in the last 2 years of her life, he said. When she couldn't do much else, she painted. Sophia turned to look at him. He was watching the room with the same steady, contained expression he wore everywhere at the fundraiser, in the living room, on the porch, but his hands, she noticed, were pressed flat against the doorframe, as if he needed the support. She thought she understood then. She thought she had the whole picture. But he said, "That's not the whole story." He told her the rest slowly, standing in the doorway of Emma's room while the rain drummed steadily outside. In the last months of her life, Emma had become frightened of a particular kind of disappearance. Not of dying, she had made a kind of peace with that, or so she told Ethan, in her honest and unflinching way. She was frightened of being forgotten, not by him. She knew Ethan would carry her. She was frightened of her work disappearing into storage units and estate sales and the attics of people who didn't know what they were looking at. She had spent her whole adult life making things, and the thought that those things might simply cease to exist or worse, drift unmoored through the world without context, without the name and story attached to them, was the thing that kept her awake in the nights when the pain was bad. She talked to Ethan about it. She talked about it in the matter-of-fact way. She talked about most things, not asking him to fix it but simply stating what was true. And Ethan, who had been a structural architect for 15 years, who had run his own firm, who had designed 4 buildings that were still standing in 3 different cities, listened. And then he made a promise. He told her that nothing she had made would be lost. He told her that every painting, every sketchbook, every scrap of paper with a drawing on it would be preserved and honored and shown to the world. He told her that her work would outlast both of them. She had looked at him with those eyes that were already less present than they used to be, and said, "I know you'll keep it. I just don't want you to keep it alone." He hadn't known what she meant by that, not then. He thought he did. He was wrong. He found out what she meant slowly, over the years that followed. Sophia sat down on the floor of Emma's room. There was nowhere else to sit, and listened. Ethan leaned against the doorframe and talked in a low, even voice. And outside the rain became heavier, and the afternoon light shifted from gray to deep gray, and Sophia stopped thinking about anything except the story she was hearing. Ethan had closed his architecture firm within a year of Emma's death. He had sold most of his assets, the apartment in the city, the car, the investment accounts, and had used the money to do 3 things. He had set up a small trust to preserve Emma's artwork and pay for proper archival storage. He had funded 5 annual scholarships in her name at the Art Institute where she had studied, and he had organized, over the course of 4 years, 7 traveling exhibitions of her paintings that had visited 12 cities and been seen by tens of thousands of people. He had done all of it quietly, without publicizing his own involvement, without seeking credit or acknowledgement. He had moved to Millbrook because the rent was low and the community center job had come at the right moment, and because it was far enough from the city that no one there knew who he had been before. He had built his small life around its essential commitments, keeping Emma's work alive, keeping his promise, and he had let everything else go. The art world had noticed Emma's work. Eventually, her paintings now sold for significant sums at auction. Her name appeared in books about contemporary American painters. The art institute where she had studied had named a studio after her. None of that had come from Ethan's efforts alone, but his efforts had been the original engine of it. The thing that had kept the work visible and available long enough for the world to catch up. Sophia sat on the floor and pressed her fingers to her mouth and tried not to cry again, and failed. "You gave up everything," she said. "I kept the thing that mattered," he said. He said it simply, not dramatically, the way he said most things. She stayed longer than she had planned. They moved back to the living room when the floor grew uncomfortable, and Ethan made a pot of tea, and they sat on opposite ends of the worn sofa with their cups and kept talking. Or he kept talking and she kept listening, which felt like a different thing from what she usually did at the end of long days, which was talk while other people listened. He told her about the years after Emma died, about learning to be alone in a way that was different from the loneliness of ordinary life, a specific, textured aloneness. The kind that has a shape and a name and a face. About how he had stayed busy enough for the first 3 years that grief had been largely a background noise, something he was aware of the way you're aware of weather. Always present but possible to function around. About the 4th year, when the exhibitions were winding down, and the scholarships were running smoothly, and the trust was established, and there was suddenly nothing left to do, and the background noise became the entire room. About how he had looked around at his life, and found that it was small and clean and contained, and that he had chosen exactly this, and that he did not know how to want anything else. Then he stopped talking for a while. The rain had lightened. Sophia looked at the wall of photographs, at Emma's face in 200 moments of her living, and she thought about the folder she had seen on the corner of the flat file cabinet in Emma's room, slightly apart from the others, its label worn as if it had been handled many times. She asked about it. Ethan looked at her for a moment as if deciding something, and then he got up and came back with the folder and set it on the coffee table between them. She opened it. Inside were architectural drawings and budget projections and correspondence with city planners, all of it more than a decade old. And at the top of the first page, in Emma's handwriting, the Free Art Center, a place where everyone creates. Emma had dreamed, in the years before she got sick, of building a community arts space that would be genuinely free and accessible, not free in the grant-funded, application-required way, that most community arts spaces were free, but fully free, walk-in, no registration, no income verification, just materials and light and space and instruction available to anyone who came through the door. She had sketched out the concept, talked to city planners, connected with potential donors. She had gotten further than a dream, but not as far as a building. The illness had taken the project from her before it could take root. Ethan had found the folder in her files after she died and had added it to his list of things to preserve, but preserving it and completing it were different orders of magnitude, and he had been honest with himself, over the years, about the limits of what remained possible. The scholarships, the exhibitions, the archive trust, those had consumed almost everything he had. There was nothing left. He had made peace with that, or told himself he had, the way he had made peace with a number of things that were not truly resolved but had reached an equilibrium he could live with. He watched Sophia, read through the folder. She turned the pages slowly. The way she turned the pages of things that mattered to her. When she reached the last page, a hand-sketched floor plan in Emma's distinctive drafting hand, rooms labeled with things like sunlit studio and children's corner, and the hallway of maid things, she looked up at Ethan and said, "How much would it take?" He named a figure that was large but not impossible, not for her. She said, "I want to fund it." He said, "No." She looked at him. He said, "I don't want charity." She said, "I know you don't. This isn't charity. This is a woman's dream that deserves to be real, and you can't finish it alone, and I can help." He said nothing for a long moment. Outside, the last of the rain had stopped, and the evening was coming in through the windows in long horizontal bars of pale gold light. He looked at the photographs on the wall. He looked at Emma's face in 197 moments, and he said, "I would need it to carry her name. Only her name." Sophia said, "Of course." They sat with that for a while. Then Sophia said, "Will you let me see the plans?" And Ethan said, "Yes." What followed was several months of a collaboration that neither of them had planned, and both of them, later, would describe as the most clarifying thing they had ever been part of. Sophia brought the resources and the infrastructure and the connections. Ethan brought the architectural knowledge he had set aside, but never lost. The vision he had been keeping in a worn folder for a decade, and the precise, intimate understanding of what Emma would have wanted. They met twice a week, first in Sophia's office and then increasingly at Ethan's house, where the plans spread across the dining table and Emma's presence in the photographs on the wall seemed to participate in the conversations in some quiet, non-mystical way simply as a reminder of what they were working toward. Sophia was surprised to discover that Ethan was not the simple man she had initially categorized him as. And then, she was embarrassed by her surprise. And then she got past the embarrassment and simply paid attention. He understood structures and spaces with a depth that went beyond technical knowledge. He understood how rooms felt, how light moved through a building at different hours, how the arrangement of a doorway could make a person feel welcomed or uncertain before they had consciously registered anything. He had opinions about materials and proportions that he defended quietly but firmly. He made her justify her decisions, not aggressively but persistently, and she found that she valued this. She was used to being the smartest person in the room in the way that power makes you the smartest person in the room, and she had learned to be careful about that particular kind of intelligence. Ethan made her earn her conclusions, and she respected that. They found a building, a former warehouse on a half-acre lot, near the edge of Millbrook's small downtown, close to the community center, in a neighborhood that had been consistently underserved by the cultural institutions that did exist in the area. Ethan redesigned the interior from the ground up. Sophia navigated the permits and the financing and the contractor relationships. They hired local artists to paint the exterior. They sourced materials thoughtfully, choosing suppliers who aligned with Emma's values as Ethan understood them. There was a large, high-ceilinged main studio with north-facing skylights, exactly as Emma had sketched. There was a smaller room for printmaking. There was a hallway lined with display boards for showing community members' work. There was a sign-out library of art books. There was a kitchen where participants could gather and eat and talk. There was, in the far corner of the main studio, a dedicated wall where Emma's own paintings would hang on permanent rotation from the Archive Trust, so that the work that had inspired the space would be continuously present in it. The name over the door, in hand-painted letters, on reclaimed wood, read, "The Emma Reyes Art Center, free and open to all." The opening day arrived on a Saturday in March, early enough in the year that there was still a bite in the air but late enough that the light had started to return in earnest, the pale bright light of early spring that makes everything look clean and slightly new, as if the world has been wiped down overnight and set out again more carefully. Sophia had arranged for the opening to be marked quietly, no photographers, no press releases sent to city desk editors, no ribbon to cut, no speeches prepared and read from index cards. Just the doors open and the lights on and the work on the walls and the tables set up with materials and people coming in from the street. They had argued, mildly, about this decision. Sophia had instincts around visibility and public presence that were professional and well-founded, and part of her knew that a launch event, with the right coverage, could establish the center's reputation in a way that would serve it for years. Ethan had listened to her case, and then said, simply, "Emma would have hated a ribbon cutting." Sophia had thought about it for exactly 4 seconds, and said, "You're right." So there was no ribbon. There was a handwritten sign on the door that said, "Open, come in," and a vase of early daffodils on the table just inside the entrance, and the smell of fresh paint just barely fading into the smell of wood and possibility. And the people came in. They came steadily, from the first hour, families and students and older adults and teenagers who stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping all the way inside, looking around at the high ceilings and the paintings and the open tables full of pencils and watercolors and clay, with the specific expression of people who have been handed something they weren't expecting to be given and are not yet sure it is real. A woman who taught 3rd grade at the elementary school 3 blocks away, came in with a small group of students and stood in the middle of the main studio and turned in a slow circle and said, to no one in particular, "This is exactly what we needed." An elderly man named Walter Ethan recognized him from the fundraiser. The man whose water glass he had righted on the night that had set all of this in motion came in and sat down at one of the tables and picked up a pencil and began to draw, without asking anyone's permission, without looking around for guidance or approval, as if he had been waiting for precisely this opportunity for a very long time and had not wanted to waste another minute of it. Ethan stood in the main studio for most of the morning, not directing or explaining, just present, moving through the room with the unhurried attentiveness that had always been his particular quality, the ability to be exactly where he was needed without having to announce himself. He answered questions when people had them. He showed a teenager how the flat file drawers worked, pulling them open one by one and explaining what kind of paper lived in each one, with the patience of someone who understood that the point of telling someone how a drawer works is not the drawer itself, but the confidence it gives them to use it on their own. He helped a woman hang her painting on the community display wall, taking her seriously when she deliberated between two positions on the rail, waiting while she stepped back and considered, not offering an opinion until she asked for one. He was doing, Sophia observed from across the room, exactly what he had always done at the community center. Only now the context had expanded to contain everything he actually was, everything that had been compressed into that smaller life, and was only now finding the space it required. Around noon, when the room was full and warm with people and conversation, Sophia watched him cross to the far corner where Emma's paintings hung and stop in front of the largest one. It was a landscape, a wide, open view of something that might have been the high desert of New Mexico, all burnt orange and deep shadow, and one narrow band of luminous sky along the top edge. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at it for a long time. Then his lips moved. She couldn't hear what he said. She was 20 feet away, and the room was full of sound. And he spoke very quietly, barely more than a breath, but she had been paying close attention to him for months by then, and she could read the shape of the words from where she stood. "I kept my promise." He stood there for another minute, perfectly still, and then he breathed out slowly, and the set of his shoulders changed in some way that Sophia could not have described precisely, but that she recognized as something releasing, something that had been held for 9 years and was only now, in this room, in this light, in this specific fulfillment, able to let go. She walked across the room and stood beside him. He glanced at her sidelong, and she did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said, and he did not say anything either. After a moment she reached out and took his hand, not as a gesture toward anything, simply as the acknowledgement of a presence, the way you reach for the arm of someone standing beside you at something that is too large to witness alone. His hand was warm and calloused, and he did not pull away. They stood in front of Emma's painting for a while, the room full of life around them, the sound of pencils on paper, of children asking questions, of Walter in the corner humming something quietly to himself while he drew, of the door opening again and again and again, as people from the neighborhood came in out of the March air and into the light. Ethan's thumb moved, once, across the back of Sophia's hand. It was a small thing, a very small thing. But she felt it clearly, and she thought of what Emma had said to him in her last months. "I just don't want you to keep it alone." She thought Emma had probably known something that Ethan hadn't known yet, and that the knowing of it had been patient, which was the quality most love had, when it was the real kind, the willingness to wait inside a person for as long as it took for them to be ready to receive it. Ethan had spent 9 years keeping his promise, and he had kept it completely and without resentment, but he had also, in doing so, kept himself inside a particular perimeter. And now the promise was fulfilled. The center was real. The paintings were seen. Emma's name was on the door, in hand-painted letters, where it would remain. He had done it. He had given her everything she had asked for, and whatever came next, whatever opened up in the space that had been occupied for so long by obligation and grief and faithful, solitary love that was something new, something that had not yet been named. In the weeks that followed, the Emma Reyes Art Center became, quickly and naturally, a fixture of the neighborhood. Classes filled. The community display wall turned over every 2 weeks with new work. Local teachers started bringing students. A retired ceramics instructor named Margaret volunteered to teach a weekly hand-building class that drew a waiting list within the first month. The Archive Trust, which had been Ethan's first and most foundational act of preservation, loaned additional paintings from Emma's collection on a rotating basis, so that the work on the walls was never static, never frozen in a single interpretation of who she had been. People who had never heard of Emma Reyes came in off the street and stopped in front of her paintings and felt something. And sometimes they asked the staff who had made these, and the answer to that question carried her name outward into the world in the organic, unchoreographed way that Ethan had always hoped for and never been able to engineer on his own. Emma had feared disappearing. She had not disappeared. She had multiplied. Ethan went back to work at the community center, but he also began spending time at the art center, not in any official capacity, at first, but simply because it drew him, the way things draw people when the things have cost them something real. He helped with maintenance, of course, because that was his default mode of service, and because the pipes in the old warehouse had opinions of their own, and the north skylights needed occasional persuasion, but he also started to be present in the studio, in a different way. He would sit sometimes at one of the long tables in the afternoon, after the volunteer instructors had left and the space was quiet, and he would draw. Small things at first, the architectural sketches that had been his way of thinking through problems for 20 years, plans and elevations and structural details worked out on paper, the way other people work out their thoughts in words. Then larger things, looser things, the pencil moving without a predetermined destination. Then, one afternoon in late April, he stretched a canvas and mixed a color and began to paint for the first time in his life, not because he thought he was good at it, not because anyone had suggested it or asked it of him, but because the room asked for it, and because there is something that happens to people in the presence of real creative energy that makes them want to add their own voice to the conversation, however imperfectly, however haltingly, because the voice itself is the point. Sophia came by that afternoon and found him in front of the canvas and stood in the doorway for a moment watching. And when he noticed her there, he didn't look embarrassed, which she noted with quiet pleasure. He just gestured at the chair beside him. She sat down, and he kept painting badly, he would say later. Generously, she would say, and they talked about small things, the kind of things you talk about when the large things have already been said, and you are learning what it is like to simply be in the same room together, without an agenda. The light in the studio at that hour came through the north skylights at an angle that lit the dust in the air and made everything in the room glow slightly. The canvases and the tables and the jars of brushes and the two of them, and somewhere across the street someone was mowing an early patch of grass, and the smell of it drifted in through the open window, green and seasonal, and alive with the particular insistence of things that are becoming. She asked him once, in those early weeks of knowing each other in the new context, the context where the story had been told, and the room had been built, and the keeping alone was over, what he thought Emma had meant, at the end, whether he understood now what she had been trying to say when she told him she didn't want him to keep it alone. He was quiet for a while, longer than his usual pause, the kind of quiet that has actual weight in it. He mixed a color on the palette, a particular shade of blue that he had been trying to get right for several sessions, the blue of the band of sky in Emma's desert landscape, that luminous, complicated blue that was not quite cerulean, and not quite cobalt, and not quite any single named thing. And he looked at it, and then looked away. He said he thought she had known him well enough to understand that he would do exactly what he did, that he would keep the promise so thoroughly and so seriously that he might never look up from it. She had been trying to give him permission to look up, eventually. She had been trying to tell him that honoring her did not require abandoning himself. He said this carefully, as if he was still working out the last few parts of it, assembling the understanding in real time from pieces that had been available to him for a long time, but had never quite arranged themselves into this particular shape before. I think I understand it now, he said finally. I think it took this, he gestured at the room, the paintings, the windows, the light to understand it. She looked at him. Good, she said. That was all. Good. The art center's first anniversary was marked with a small celebration, a potluck, at Ethan's suggestion, rather than a gala. People brought food and set it on the long tables in the main studio and ate standing up in front of the paintings. Walter, who had become a regular presence at the Tuesday afternoon open studio sessions, brought a pie he had baked himself and stood next to it with the proprietary air of someone who was proud of a thing he had made. He had also, over the course of the past year, produced a series of pen and ink drawings that now occupied an entire section of the community display wall, careful, observational drawings of ordinary life in Millbrook, the corner store, the library steps, the particular way the morning light came through the windows of the community center where Ethan still worked. They were not the drawings of a trained artist. They were the drawings of a person who had been given a room in which to be curious, and the result of that curiosity was something that made people stop and look. Emma, Sophia thought, would have loved them. At the end of the evening, when most people had gone and Ethan was helping stack the folding chairs, Sophia stood in front of Emma's paintings one more time. The same large desert landscape, the burnt orange and the deep shadow and the narrow luminous sky. She thought about what it cost a person to love something enough to build a life around its absence. She thought about how that kind of love, the fierce, preserving, faithful kind, could be both the most sustaining thing a person had and also the wall they built without noticing between themselves and whatever came next. She thought about Ethan, who had been both things at once for a very long time, and who was now tentatively, carefully, with the particular caution of someone who has been still for a long time and is just beginning to move, becoming a person who was present in his own life again, as well as Emma's. He came to stand beside her. He had his coat on. The room was almost empty, just the two of them, and the paintings, and the low hum of the ventilation system, and the last of the evening light coming through the skylights at a steep, reddened angle that turned everything in the room amber and gold. He looked at the painting, and she looked at it too. And then he looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment that lasted exactly as long as it needed to last. He had, she noticed, a different quality of stillness about him tonight than the stillness she had first encountered at the fundraiser all those months ago. That earlier stillness had been armored, sealed off from the outside, the stillness of a person who has decided to need nothing. This was something else, open, present, almost tentative, the stillness of a door that has been unlatched and is waiting to see what the wind decides. Then he said, "Can I buy you dinner?" He said it simply, without fanfare, without any of the elaborate preparation she might have expected from a man who had been so careful about everything for so long. She said, "Yes." They turned off the last of the lights and locked the door of the Emma Reyes Art Center behind them, and the bolt of the lock made a small, clean sound in the quiet street. They walked out into the evening, which was warm now in the way. Evenings in early spring can be warm if you're willing to stay in it a little longer than you planned, if you're willing to let the night take its time. The sign above the door caught the street light and held it, the hand-painted letters precise and deliberate and unhurried. The name on it did not change. The name on it would not change, but the story inside it had found a way to keep going, which was, when you thought about it, the only thing a story ever truly needs, not to end, but to continue, in new mouths, new hands, new rooms still being built. Sometimes the thing that makes a person weep when they walk into a house is not the poverty they expected to find there. It is not the loneliness they braced themselves to witness, not the evidence of hardship that had drawn their curiosity like a question mark hanging in the air. It is the discovery that a person has spent years building a monument to something lost quietly, without recognition, without complaint, without an audience, without ever being asked to, and that the monument is not made of marble or money or any of the materials that the world usually agrees to value. It is made of kept promises and carefully tended gardens and 200 photographs arranged with love along a wall, and rooms that hold the work of a person who feared being forgotten and the life of a single man who decided, 9 years ago, that she would not be, who gave up buildings and accounts and a version of himself that the world had been prepared to reward, and chose instead the harder and quieter work of remembering well. That is what Sophia Bennett found in Ethan Carter's house on a rainy afternoon in October. Not poverty, not loneliness, not the sad story she had half expected to discover and fold neatly into her understanding of who he was. She found a great love that had never stopped. She found a man who had been faithful to something beyond the ordinary reach of faithfulness, and she found, in the corner of a locked room, a folder with a dream in it that still had the shape of something possible. That is why she wept. And why, when she walked back out into the world afterward, she carried something new with her, something that did not have a name yet, but that moved in her like a beginning.